All right, welcome to our quick lecture talking about how does the study of geopolitics help us understand a little bit more about the world. The slides were designed to accompany the textbook People, Places, and Culture, and I'm of course Miss Gall, and I'll be your host for the lecture. So a little bit of history of geopolitics. And basically, when we talk about classical geopolitics, really what we're talking about is the late 19th, early 20th century. And we're talking specifically about geopoliticians that are usually part of the German school or the British or American school. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about what each of those mean and kind of what they thought. So when we talk about the German school, really what they're looking at is trying to analyze and explain why certain states become powerful and then how they become powerful. So they're looking at those processes and change across time. And really one of the major guys that we talk about when we talk about this is a guy named Friedrich Ratzel. And he's influenced by the ideas of Darwin, and so he's looking at the state specifically as basically a biological organism whose life cycle extends from birth through maturity and ultimately decline and death. And like any biological organism, what Ratzel thinks needs to happen is that states need to expand to survive. Okay, so we talk about this as drawing a blank on the word right now. It'll come back to me eventually. It's essentially a biological explanation. Okay, so if you're at all familiar with the biology of organisms, then think of that, only think of it as applied to countries. Okay, and this is heavily influential, especially in the early to mid 20th century. And we're talking about what's going on with Germany, and especially World War II. Okay, so this is what gives geopolitics really kind of a bad name. We're talking about the British and the American schools. Really, the big name is Sir Halford J. Mackinder, and he writes an article called The Geographical Pivot of History in the Royal Geographical Society's Geographical Journal. And his argument is that ultimately it's going to be a land-based power, not a sea power, that would rule the world. Okay, so it plays into, in some ways, some of those same ideas when we're talking about geopolitics on the global stage, and we're talking about especially World War II. That's like you can see these playing out a little bit beforehand, but World War II is kind of the classic example of where we see these ideas really playing themselves out on the big stage. And Hitler is very influenced by these ideas. So you can see it in his idea that Germany must expand in order to survive, and that Germany ultimately has the right to rule these territories. Okay, because Germany is a better society, and I put better in quotation marks, not to insult any of my German friends, but because Hitler would have meant it in that racist kind of way that Hitler meant so many things. And so what Hitler wants to do is spread out across and take control because he's got this superior society as he sees it. Okay. Bearing in mind that at this point in history, Britain is one of the strongest militaries in the world. The US absolutely is one of the strongest militaries in the world, coming out of World War I, largely because we are not completely destroyed, and not as destroyed, not as devastated by World War I. Okay, so Britain has dominance on the seas to a large degree. And Mackinder's arguing that dominance on the seas isn't enough. It's got to be somebody who's dominating the land. And specifically, he looks at what he sees as being, he calls it the heartland. Okay. And the heartland is kind of that middle area of Europe, their breadbasket, right around Ukraine, where if you can control that, then you can control access to a lot of the resources and the food and things. And if you can control the food, you can control the people, is kind of his idea. Okay, so geopolitics coming out of World War II, because it ends up being used in such crazily poor ways and to justify such insane activities, ends up being a term with really negative connotations and one that's not used so often anymore. So instead, we might talk about the geography of politics or political geography, but we don't generally use that term geopolitics except when we're talking about this period in the late 19th, early 20th century. Okay, and remember I was talking about Mackinder and the heartland, and as you see coming out of World War II, if you're familiar with the history at all, you know that one of the things Russia does is it sets up a series of satellite states and buffer states in between itself and Western Europe, all through Eastern Europe. Okay, and to counteract that, then that's when we see the growth of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO. Okay, and the whole point of NATO is to try and limit and contain Russian expansion out of the heartland and Russian, what they view as attempted Russian domination and control. And I think the Russians would argue that that was a different phenomenon. But when you look at it from both sides, you can certainly understand why one side sees one thing, right? We're trying to keep ourselves from being invaded for the umpteenth time, and the other side saying, whoa, 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 you're expanding your control, and we're worried about what's going to happen to us. So we talk about critical geopolitics. Now what we're talking about is these intellectuals that really work to construct ideas about statecraft and about the role of geography and geographical circumstances and places, and these ideas that influence and reinforce political behaviors and policy choices. Okay, and this is what I was talking about with Hitler, for example. Okay, and then what these guys try to do is affect what happens and how most people interpret what happens, right? Hitler is heavily influenced by critical geopolitics, as he's looking at the geography and he's really trying to analyze it and figure out what's going to work best. And he looks at the countries in Europe, and there's a reason why he moves west first, and then he decides to move east. Okay, and he does move a little bit east, but he stops himself, at least for a little while, at Poland, and then he moves into Russia when he's ready to take on the Russians, or when he thinks he's ready to take on the Russians. Okay, so coming out of World War II, it is a very different geopolitical world order. Prior to World War II, it's really a multipolar world order in many ways. So you've got the different countries in Europe and the balance of power that's coming out. You've got the United States, which is kind of the up-and-comer. You've got China, which is kind of the old man, right? The Ottoman Empire, which after World War II is no more, but had been the sick man of Europe, right? In the Cold War, what you see is a bipolar world. So there are really only two major influences. We've got the Soviet Union, and we call it the West. Really, it's the United States and Western Europe, okay? Or I would argue United States, Canada, Western Europe, Australia, basically those heavily Western European influenced countries, okay? And what ends up developing is essentially this kind of new world order where people are working together to try and discipline rogue states slowly but surely. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And partially that has to do with what different countries view as their interests. Okay, so what we see is the United Nations builds up as a way to bring people together and talk. But within the United Nations, there are things, for example, the permanent members of the Security Council who can limit what actions are taken simply by vetoing something, and they get a veto that, you know, nobody gets to say, well, we don't like that. There's no overturning that veto. Okay. After the Soviet Union falls in the early 1990s, what we see is one country, specifically the United States, comes to a position of power and dominance, and other countries increasingly follow its lead, and we call that unilateralism. Okay, so one country. And this is where if you're at all familiar with cultural battles, for example, between popular culture and local culture in some countries, or a lot of anti-American sentiment, it grows out of this unilateral outcome to the Cold War, where the United States takes over, for lack of a better term, takes over. Okay, and people see the United States, rightly or wrongly, make the argument either way, as kind of pushing its culture on everybody else. Okay, but either way, no argument, the United States comes out, and the United States comes out on top and comes out as a leader. And with a lot of other countries wanting to try and follow its lead and follow the same course that it's followed to get to where it is today. So I'm going to go back to that slide so you don't have to stare at a black screen. Um, just to sum up a little bit, we talked a little bit about critical geopolitics. We talked about Alfred Mackinder and a little bit about the Heartland. And we talked about Friedrich Ratzel and a little bit about organic theory. That's what it's called. And then we also talked a little bit about the history of the 20th century and just touched on especially the impact of World War II and creating that split between the critical geopolitics before and the bipolar and then ultimately unipolar, unilateral world that comes after World War II. So there's some major split points that you kind of need to know in terms of your historical chronology, right? World War II, huge. The end of the Cold War, another big one. Okay, just in terms of what's going on in the history of political geography and the way the world is organizing itself. So if you have any questions, by all means, please feel free to raise them. Just bring them to me in class today or when I see you next, and I will see you when I see you.